my dears, I have made a few videos thus far kind of covering different teeny tiny aspects of things to keep in mind while consuming media with disabled people or characters in it or creating said media. They will probably be linked in the description and or in the cards above as they come up throughout this video, but I decided to elaborate on some of those points and also consolidate them all into one place so that it's easier for you to send to people who need it. So today we are going to talk about the interesting catch-22 of disability being absolutely everywhere without us really noticing it, and why that is, aka the origins of storytelling, those really loud crows, the major issue with disability representation, how that affects reality, and what we can potentially do about it. And then in next week's video, we will talk more specifically about how to create and portray a disabled character with everything that we learned today in mind. Also, if you don't know who I am and are like, why is this random person qualified to be talking about this? They seem like chaos embodied just based on what I've seen thus far. Hi, my name is Sydney. I use they, them pronouns. I'm working on an undergrad thesis, but it's like a master's level thesis. I just don't want to do school anymore. Yeah, on disabled media representation, accessible education, disabled theater history, and education, all leading up to directing and playing Christopher in the world's first all neurodivergent cast and crew production of The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. This thesis has thus far involved around 75-ish books, which I'm about 3/4 of the way through, and lots of other research, curated from anywhere and everywhere, and therefore I am very painfully qualified to be talking about this topic. And in the description, for those of you who need it, I am a white person in my early 20s with light brown curly hair that is shoulder length, and I'm currently wearing a navy blue-ish button-up shirt. I say navy blue-ish because it's like kind of light blue, kind of navy blue. I'm sitting in front of a bookshelf and it also has some yellow flowers on it and lots of little knickknacks and arts and things and stuff. Yeah, let's get into it. So first of all, we're going to be talking about stories. And if you're thinking, how does storytelling relate to anything at all whatsoever? Trust me on this, because basically, like anthropologically, that's a word, stories exist to explain, communicate, and teach. And more specifically, they exist to explain the unknown and the misunderstood. Sure, they're also for entertainment. I don't think that we watch reality TV directly to explain the unknown and the misunderstood, but one could argue that on some level you are doing that without realizing it because we want to understand what their strange lives look like. Insert freak show discussion up here. But anyway, what is the most unknown and misunderstood thing in our society? It's difference. And what has always been the most obvious and visible difference in society? Ding, 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 disability. Yay, good work everybody, you figured it out. So time and time again, we see disability as central to our stories. And you might be thinking, what do you mean? Aren't we like struggling to get representation? And that's the interesting thing about disability representation. We have way too much of it. Like, we see hunchback beggars, we see the saintly Tiny Tims, the blind superheroes who make up for it with their super hearing, the villains with facial differences who try to hide it with a mask, literally everything you've ever seen in an art museum. I could go on. And you don't recognize this stuff until you start to look for it, and then you realize it's absolutely everywhere, and you somehow completely miss a Darth Vader and Captain Hook and Thor and Nemo are all also disability representation. Like, somehow my brain just got rid of that. But there's actually a reason for that. Humans literally will screen in images of disability and then screen out the disability part of it. And this is because we are all socialized to feel uncomfortable around impairment and disability. So as a result, in our brains, we compartmentalize the disability and impairment as isolated incidents that don't happen very frequently. And then we just kind of forget about them. And this also isn't just in fictional media. I mean, do you think of Virginia Woolf or Beethoven or Aesop? Yes, that Aesop. Or Frida Kahlo, where FDR is disabled? Probably not. There's literally a recognized phenomenon that the more successful a disabled person is, the more their disability gets erased from the public narrative. But then at the same time, we also tell stories almost exclusively about disability in an effort to explain the unexplainable, which means that we take in information about disability, the story explains the disability and gives it meaning, and then we filter out both the explanation and the disability and we forget about it, so when we look back at the story, we don't even realize that it was there. And yet our brain still went and made the connection between the disability and that explanation that we saw. Which means the next time we come in contact with disability, that's going to trigger that same pathway in your brain and it's going to use the explanation from that story in order to explain the disability you're currently encountering and then move on. Which on the surface doesn't seem like a major issue, but then if every single disabled person that you see in the media is a villain in their story, often because of their disability, and then every time you forget about it afterwards automatically, you're not going to understand why when you come across a disabled person in the wild, you automatically get really bad vibes from them and are convinced that they're a terrible human being without knowing anything about them, because you don't realize consciously that your brain made the connection from A to B based on what you've seen in the media, and you just think, gut feeling, they're a bad person, I'm going to avoid them. So the struggle with disability representation is not, in fact, the lack of it. It's also not really the major quality of it either. It's the obsessive need to find meaning in disability, which on one level makes sense. Disability is the one reminder that we have absolutely no control over the human body, and that's terrifying to people because we like to think we have control over our own bodies. And if we're able to explain and find meaning behind disability, that feels like we have controlled it just a little bit so that we feel better, but then that's at the cost of disabled people. Also, in case I forget to mention this later, because I will, there's this incredible documentary that I watched. I think it was on Amazon. I'll link it in the description for you. It was called Code of the Freaks. I cannot recommend it enough. It's an analysis of all of the tropes and unofficial rules of different kinds of media representation of disability, with like case study examples, and it's really, really good. And you should watch it, even though like a lot of my textbook authors were speakers in the film, and like I know that they're real people, but seeing a face and like a voice next to their name felt kind of like running into your teacher in the supermarket. Like the vibes were just strange. But anyway, that's a unique to me problem. So you're gonna enjoy it and you're not gonna think about that at all. Now we're gonna break up our analysis and critique of disabled media representation into two sections. The two sections very much overlap, like all the time, but I wanted to organize it a bit so that it's less me just throwing a ton of abstract information directly into your face, because that feels rude and overwhelming and also inaccessible, and I'm not here for that. So the first action we're going to talk about is narrative prosthesis, and this is a term coined by David T. Mitchell and Sharon L. Snyder, and as they describe, our phrase narrative prosthesis is meant to indicate that disability has been used throughout history as a crutch upon which literary narratives lean for their representational power, disruptive potentiality, and analytical insight. So basically, disability representation props up stories that are meant to tell you what it means to be human without the disabled character or the disability story and whatever. The conflict of the story would not exist, but it's also, the disability is no way central emotionally to the story. Usually disability is seen as a figure of trauma or tragedy or pity or terror or inspiration, or all of them at once. Think your typical inspiration corn, or the exact opposite of what inspiration corn might be. I'm not quite sure, but I'm sure that it is a thing. Let me know what you think. Now, the second thing we're going to talk about is the whole "we are not a metaphor" discussion. Disability is often used as shorthand for internal psychological or emotional state. To quote Narrative Prosthesis, the book, there's a book called Narrative Prosthesis with the theories of, yeah, I'm talking about the book, not the concept. The metaphoric opportunism of literature is a form of public slander. Basically, literature relies on deviance as a shortcut for expressing things. Also not ideal. So let's look at some of this in practice. One prime example of narrative prosthesis is the caretaker narrative. Ooh, a way of telling stories about disability that rarely give the disabled character any real power and instead often use the syndrome to underpin the moral theme, which is not necessarily about disability at all. This is cookie cutter narrative prosthesis. It's probably the most common, and in the majority of cases it's about a mother overcoming adversity, the biggest adversity being handling their disabled child, and it's about how difficult it is to be the parent or caregiver for a disabled person, and rarely takes the actual thoughts, feelings, emotions, etc. of the disabled person into question in writing these stories. These narratives are often found in autobiographies, but they do pop up in other fictional places as well, and they often rely on disability as a crutch for their trauma corn, inspiration corn sort of narrative, and it's frankly quite gross. They typically portray disability as inherently traumatic and often will say something to the effect of, "My kid with a disability is valuable and important, but groups of them are subversive and weird and bad. Mine's the only one that matters," which is also gross. There's also the sibling edition of the caretaker narrative, in which, because the sibling is usually somebody between the ages of like 12 and 19, it's more socially acceptable for them to center themselves aggressively in the narrative and say more brash and selfish and rude and offensive things. These portrayals tend to be less restrictive than the traditional caretaker narrative because they're not as forced to mold themselves around disability as their main plot. But it can also perpetuate some really harmful stereotypes because siblings can say some mean things and get away with it because, oh, it's just my brother, you know? Now, another prime example of narrative prosthesis is the super crip, somebody who becomes disabled but then overcomes it and is even better afterwards than they were before, usually in like that this is not a human sense. Like, we see this most frequently with stories of people becoming disabled and then getting really cool superhuman prosthetics that make them almost cyborgs so they can do cooler things than they could before. Or they can become blind and suddenly they got super hearing, or something else like that. We usually see this narrative in superhero films. I think there's at least 15 Marvel superheroes with this basic storyline. But you can also find it in so many other stories, specifically Soul Surfer and Regarding Henry, comes straight off the top of my head. But it's everywhere. And I will say that, like, in my own life, becoming disabled did make me a better version of myself, and it made me happier. Like, I'm way happier now that I'm disabled than I was before. But also, in narratives, it's usually like, disability happens. Now I have depression, and I am wallowing, and I am sad. And now I am superhuman, and everything is perfect, and I don't care anymore. And that's not real. It makes me feel like I'm not allowed to be upset sometimes, that there are things that I cannot do anymore. And like, one never overcomes disability. We integrate it into our lives. and these narratives just kind of don't show that ever. So you can be very valid as a disabled person and not be able to do superhuman things. That's allowed and frankly preferred. And the supercrip trope is such a great example of how so-called positive disability representation can do just as much harm as so-called negative representation. But anyway, in the metaphor category, we'll scoot over to that one, we often see outward physicality as shorthand for internal psychological or emotional state, as I said earlier. Think Richard III being hunchbacked. Thank you, Shakespeare. I'm gonna make a video specifically about that at some point because I have thoughts. Captain Hook missing a hand, for example. The emotional states that disabilities seem to portray, they're not exclusively in the evil category. That's just the more common one that we see. We usually see it as an example either of full villainy or innocent victimhood, often explained by some theorists as saints with divine purpose or sinners incurring God's punishment. And we talked about this in my DEI video where we discussed the theories of disability aesthetics. You can check that out over here. But we cognitively process imperfection either with a feeling of disgust or with a feeling of pity and concern. Those are the two main ones that our body and brain process, which is why we have these innate reactions to disability, and then media goes, oh, noted, and then it expands that and blows it up to a much bigger degree. And this kind of storytelling has been around pretty much forever, but is way more common now because in the era of silent films, grotesque outward physicality in relation to disability and villainy was almost necessary in order to get the point across quickly. And this physicality shorthand mindset is really ingrained in people who work in movement-related arts, particularly physical theater, because they've studied it for so long that the relationship between outward physicality and inward personality become inseparable in their brains, and then they unintentionally treat disabled people, particularly ones who, I don't know, want to study physical theater, as broken and subhuman. But anyway, let's move on from that, shall we? Some other things that we often see that seriously bother me include the aestheticization and fetishization of exile and disability. Some people think that people being helpless outcasts due to disability is attractive. They like that helplessness. That's why the horror genre of blind, helpless women needing protecting was so popular for so long, and frankly, it still is. And I'm not saying that disabled people can't be incredibly sexy, because we for sure can be, but the fetishization of disability and helplessness is very gross and predatory, and I hate it. Also, some fairly famous philosopher people have gone through phases of talking about how disabled people are blessed because they were exiled from this horrible society and they get a free pass to get out of it. And no. Now, we also have the killing off your disabled character, and it's very similar to how in the bury your gays thing, that prevents people from having to think about the fact that one day maybe this gay would get older and find another gay and they would be gay together. Oh, the horror. Because now you don't have to wonder. They're dead. And killing off disabled characters removes the worry of what's going to happen to them later. And also, in death, they're made safe and they're no longer suffering. And there's this really awesome trope, it's horrifically common, where when the disabled person dies, they're no longer disabled, or they meet their non-disabled half and they become whole for the first time in their lives and they can finally be at peace. Bonus points if in death their crutches fall away. That's bonus points for that. I see that way too many times. In the decades after the Second World War, cure or kill stories, which is our version of bury your gays, you have two options. Cure them or kill them off. They became significantly less common because everybody started to associate eugenics directly with the nefarious activities happening in World War II. I really don't want to get demonetized. I would argue that of late, cure or kill narratives are becoming a lot more popular again, and I would like that to stop. Please. We also have the autism voice. We talked about this in my video on autistic speech patterns. I'm not going to go through all that again. You can watch it over here. Now, how does this affect reality? It means that people usually unconsciously assume that disabled people are inherently metaphorical, either as hyper innocent or very evil, or we're just a side character who's there to prop up your story, and we're not the main character in our own stories, which needless to say, boo, don't like that, hate that, please don't do that. We're also humans, and why are you doing this to us? This is not fair. But also there's always nuance to bring into the discussion, right? For example, you will find many stories where a negative outcome befalls the disabled character, but the actual critique of the story, what the political objectives of that story are, will fall directly in line with what the movement is actually fighting for. Bad portrayal on purpose, if it's very clear what it's doing, bonus points if it's campy, can also be very good disabled representation. Kind of in the same way that if you're familiar with the queer community at all, But I'm a Cheerleader is very bad portrayal, but it does it in such a campy, out of the box way that it's actually perfect and one of the best representations that we have. And when it comes to stereotypes and good disabled representation, There's no such thing as perfect disabled representation, and there are actually a few reasons for that. First of all, good representation is boring. Good representation usually feels unnatural. It's too smooth, it's too bland, and it's too safe. The lives of human beings are generally very messy naturally, and a lot of times people trying to make so-called good representation crop out that mess altogether. Nobody likes that, it's boring, and so nobody wants to create those stories, and so nobody cares, so they don't have it. Second, you cannot create representation without stereotypes. That is literally impossible. Stereotypes exist for a reason. They do on some level reflect reality. The reason stereotypes are an issue is because they're usually the only thing that we see and they're the only representation. So rather than thinking to yourself, is this good representation or bad representation, or focusing directly on creating something and avoiding every single stereotype and trope to the best of your ability, try to focus more on whether it's a truthful representation, whether it's authentic representation, whether it feels real and honest and messy and intentional. Some of my favorite disability rep is full of stereotype, but it does so in a self-aware kind of way, in an honest and truthful and authentic way. And so I'm able to embrace all of that messiness rather than finding it very jarring as I would in something else that doesn't put as much care into its representation, if that makes sense. Also, just for what it's worth, I'm not telling you that you need to deeply analyze every single piece of everything that you watch or cut out things from your media diet that are trashy or harmful. What matters is that you are thinking critically and making sure that when you see a disabled character on screen as a villain, you can go, disability does not mean villainy, and this is an issue. They made a narrative choice for some reason, and then move on and not make those connections in your brain or consciously stop those connections in your brain, because then it becomes so much harder to internalize and to affect how you interact with disabled people in the real world, which helps everybody. Basically, you're welcome to enjoy trashy media. I enjoy trashy media. As long as you recognize that it's trashy, you're good. Yeah. So, next week, we're going to talk specifically about how to create and portray disabled characters. You are welcome to subscribe to be notified when that video comes out, or not, no pressure. You do you, babe. I don't care. Do let me know what trope bothers you the most, or if I missed any in this video. I would love to know. And as always, thanks for listening, thanks for learning. Remember, it's never too late to start over, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.